When I first began to study the Second Vatican Council, I was struck by how often it was described as the defining moment of modern Catholicism. For many Catholics today, Vatican II feels like the only council that matters, whether they view it as a breath of fresh air, a cause of controversy, or the source of confusion. But as I delved deeper into church history, I discovered a vast tradition of councils that have guided the Church through every age. From Nicaea to Trent to Vatican II, each council has clarified the faith, responded to the challenges of its time, and preserved the Church's unity. Vatican II is a part of this tradition, not a break from it. Yet, as C.S. Lewis warned about chronological snobbery, our human tendency to overvalue the recent often blinds us to the richness of what came before. This essay explores the Church's long tradition of councils, emphasizing that no single council, Vatican II included, should overshadow the others. Councils exist to clarify, not change, the Church's teachings, which remain immutable. Overemphasizing one council, or misinterpreting its directives, risks distorting the faith itself. Vatican II, for example, has often been misused to justify practices it never intended, such as the near disappearance of Latin in the Liturgy or the neglect of Gregorian chant. But this phenomenon is not unique to Vatican II. The aftermath of councils throughout history has shown that overzealous reactions and misunderstandings can sometimes obscure the true work of the Holy Spirit. By placing Vatican II in the broader context of the Church's conciliar tradition, this essay aims to challenge the tendency to treat recent events as definitive while neglecting the lessons of the past. The Church's councils are not isolated events, but part of a continuous mission to safeguard and deepen the faith. As we examine the successes, challenges, and missteps of various councils, we'll see how they affirm the unchanging nature of the Church, providing a reminder to approach any council with humility, balance, and a deep respect for the entirety of the Church's tradition. Throughout history, the Catholic Church has convened councils as moments of profound discernment, addressing crises and guiding the faithful in their pilgrimage toward God. These councils, which represent the universal Church in communion with the Pope, are landmarks in the Church's ongoing mission to proclaim the gospel in every age. While some councils, such as the First Council of Nicaea or the Council of Trent, are renowned for their historical and doctrinal significance, recent decades have seen Vatican II elevated in prominence in a way that can sometimes overshadow the rich tradition of conciliar teaching that came before it. This modern phenomenon can be partly explained by what C.S. Lewis famously called chronological snobbery, a tendency to overvalue recent developments while neglecting the wisdom of the past. In the Catholic context, this bias often manifests as an overemphasis on Vatican II, either as a break from prior tradition or as the definitive moment in the Church's history. Both approaches, however, risk misinterpreting the Council itself and detaching it from the broader tapestry of Catholic tradition. In this video, I will argue that Vatican II was one among many ecumenical councils, each contributing uniquely to the Church's journey, but none standing in isolation. Overemphasizing one council at the expense of others distorts our understanding of the Church's teaching authority. Furthermore, I will explore how the immediate aftermath of councils often involves confusion or missteps, driven by a well-meaning, but sometimes overzealous desire to implement their directives. By situating Vatican II within the broader context of church councils, we can cultivate a deeper appreciation for the unity and continuity of Catholic teaching, avoiding the pitfalls of both overreaction and neglect. Church councils hold a unique place in the life of the Catholic Church. They are extraordinary gatherings of bishops from across the world, convened by the Pope to address pressing doctrinal, disciplinary, or pastoral issues facing the Church. These councils, particularly ecumenical councils, serve as moments of profound reflection and decision-making, ensuring the Church remains faithful to her mission of proclaiming the gospel while responding to the challenges of the times. The role of a council is not to invent new doctrines, but to clarify, develop, or safeguard what the Church has always taught. Councils provide definitive answers to theological controversies, guide the faithful in matters of discipline and worship, and set the course for the Church in navigating new cultural and historical contexts. The hallmark of any council is its continuity with the tradition handed down from the apostles, rooted in the belief that the Holy Spirit guides the Church in all truth. There are different levels of church councils, but ecumenical councils stand above all others in authority. While local councils address issues specific to a region or country, ecumenical councils speak to the universal Church. From the First Council of Nicaea to Vatican II, the ecumenical councils have shaped the Church's understanding of her faith and practice, often in response to crises such as heresies, divisions, or changing historical circumstances. Each council is shaped by the unique challenges of its time. For example, the Council of Nicaea confronted the Arian heresy, which denied the full divinity of Christ. The Council of Trent responded to the theological and disciplinary upheaval caused by the Protestant Reformation. Vatican II, in turn, sought to engage the modern world through a pastoral renewal that addressed contemporary challenges. Despite these differences, all councils share the same purpose: to preserve the unity of the Church and guide her members in truth and holiness. The authority of councils lies not in their novelty, but in their fidelity to the deposit of faith. This fidelity ensures that no single council stands alone. Rather, each council builds upon the foundation laid by its predecessors. As such, councils must be understood not as isolated events, but as part of an unbroken chain of teaching and tradition stretching back to the apostolic age. This continuity is essential to understanding the role of councils within the Church. Overemphasizing one council at the expense of others risks losing sight of the broader tradition and the unity of the Church's teaching authority. By approaching councils with an awareness of their shared purpose and continuity, Catholics can better appreciate the richness of the Church's conciliar tradition and avoid the errors of isolation or distortion. The Catholic Church has convened 21 ecumenical councils over nearly 2 millennia, each addressing specific issues of doctrine, discipline, or pastoral care. While these councils vary in their immediate focus and historical impact, they are united by their aim to preserve the integrity of the faith and guide the Church in the face of new challenges. Below is a brief summary of these councils, as I think many of us forget just how many there were or what problems they solved. 1. First Council of Nicaea convened to combat Arianism. This council affirmed the full divinity of Christ by declaring him consubstantial with the Father. It produced the Nicene Creed, a cornerstone of Christian theology. 2. First Council of Constantinople. This council expanded the Nicene Creed by affirming the divinity of the Holy Spirit, countering Macedonianism, and clarifying the Church's understanding of the Trinity. 3. Council of Ephesus. To combat the Nestorian heresy, this council proclaimed Mary as Theotokos, emphasizing the unity of Christ's divine and human natures. 4. Council of Chalcedon building on Ephesus. This council defined the doctrine of Christ's two natures, divine and human, united in one person without confusion, change, division, or separation. 5. Second Council of Constantinople. This council condemned writings associated with Nestorianism, reaffirming Chalcedonian Christology while attempting to appease tensions with the Eastern Church. 6. Third Council of Constantinople addressed the monothelite heresy by affirming that Christ has two wills, human and divine, in harmony with his two natures. 7. Second Council of Nicaea restored the veneration of icons, distinguishing it from the worship owed to God alone, and ending the iconoclast controversy. 8. Fourth Council of Constantinople focused on issues of church governance and papal authority. This council deposed Patriarch Photius, reflecting early tensions between Eastern and Western Christianity. 9. First Lateran Council. The first council held in the West, it addressed church reforms stemming from the Gregorian movement, including clerical celibacy and the Church's independence from secular authorities. 10. Second Lateran Council condemned clerical marriage and heretical movements, reinforcing reforms and unity in church discipline. 11. Third Lateran Council limited papal elections to cardinals and addressed heresy, corruption, and the need for broader reforms. 12. Fourth Lateran Council. One of the most significant medieval councils, it defined the doctrine of transubstantiation, instituted annual confession, and introduced measures to strengthen church life and discipline. 13. First Council of Lyons excommunicated Emperor Frederick This and called for a crusade reflecting the interplay of spiritual and political authority in the medieval church. 14. Second Council of Lyons temporarily reunited the Eastern and Western churches and clarified teachings on purgatory and papal primacy. 15. Council of Vienne addressed the dissolution of the Knights Templar and sought to improve clerical education and discipline. 16. Council of Constance ended the Western Schism by deposing rival popes and electing Martin V. It also condemned heretical teachings, including those of Jan Hus. 17. Council of Basil Ferrara Florence attempted reconciliation with the Eastern Church and addressed internal church reforms, though its impact was limited. 18. Fifth Lateran Council preceding the Protestant Reformation. This council called for reforms, but failed to address many of the issues that would soon divide the Church. 19. Council of Trent. A pivotal response to the Protestant Reformation, Trent clarified Catholic doctrines on justification, the sacraments, and the Mass. It also implemented sweeping reforms in clerical education and discipline, revitalizing the Church for the Counter-Reformation. 20. First Vatican Council defined the doctrine of papal infallibility and addressed modern challenges such as rationalism, materialism, and the rejection of faith. 21. Second Vatican Council. Unlike previous councils, Vatican II focused on pastoral renewal and engagement with the modern world, introducing liturgical reform, promoting ecumenism, and emphasizing the universal call to holiness. This overview highlights the breadth and depth of the Church's conciliar tradition, which has addressed theological controversies, strengthened discipline, and responded to historical challenges. While each council is unique in its context and contributions, they are all part of a larger tradition that builds upon the unchanging truths of the faith. By examining a few councils in greater depth, we can better understand their significance and how they inform our perspective on Vatican II. Now let's return to the single council that gets all the attention, the most recent one. The Second Vatican Council was a watershed moment in the life of the Catholic Church. Yet it was neither the first council to provoke significant change nor the only one to face misinterpretation in its aftermath. Vatican II was distinct in its pastoral focus, seeking to engage the modern world rather than directly counter heresies or resolve internal divisions, as many earlier councils had done. This focus on aggiornamento, bringing the Church up to date alongside a return to its sources, defined its approach and set it apart from its predecessors. However, to fully understand Vatican II, we must see it as part of the broader tradition of church councils, not as a break from them. Vatican II was convened by Pope John XXIII to address the Church's role in a rapidly changing world. Its key themes included liturgical reform, ecumenism, the universal call to holiness, and dialogue with modern society. Documents such as Sacrosanctum Concilium, Lumen Gentium, and Gaudium et Spes articulated these goals, offering a vision of the Church that was deeply rooted in tradition, but expressed in ways that resonated with contemporary humanity. One of the most visible changes following Vatican II was the reform of the liturgy. The use of vernacular languages in the Mass, greater participation by the laity, and simplifications in ritual were intended to make the liturgy more accessible and spiritually engaging. Yet, these changes also became a source of confusion and division. Some interpreted the reforms as a departure from the sacred and reverent liturgical traditions of the past, while others used the Council's language to justify innovations far beyond its intent. The so-called spirit of Vatican II was often invoked to defend practices that lacked any basis in the Council's actual documents. This dynamic, where the authentic teachings of a council are overshadowed by misinterpretations or overzealous implementations, is not unique to Vatican II. For example, the Council of Trent, which clarified Catholic doctrine in response to the Protestant Reformation, also saw excesses in its application. The Council's emphasis on discipline and orthodoxy led, in some cases, to a rigidity that neglected pastoral needs, paving the way for movements like Jansenism, which distorted the Church's understanding of grace and mercy. Similarly, the First Council of Nicaea, famous for defining the divinity of Christ, did not immediately resolve the Arian controversy. For decades after the council, Arianism persisted, even gaining imperial support, while the Church endured divisions over how to interpret the Nicene Creed. These examples illustrate that confusion and challenges often accompany the aftermath of a council, as the Church works to implement its teachings in the complex realities of human history. For Vatican II, this process of implementation was made even more difficult by the cultural upheavals of the 1960s. The Council's call for dialogue with the modern world coincided with societal shifts that questioned traditional authority and embraced radical change. While Vatican II itself did not initiate these trends, its timing meant that its reforms were sometimes conflated with the broader currents of secularization. This led to polarization within the Church, with some seeing Vatican II as a rupture from tradition and others viewing it as an unfinished revolution. However, to understand Vatican II properly, we must view it in continuity with the councils that preceded it. Pope Benedict XVI emphasized this approach, calling for a hermeneutic of continuity that interprets Vatican II as part of the Church's ongoing tradition rather than a break from it. Just as the Council of Trent clarified doctrines without negating earlier teachings, Vatican II sought to renew the Church without abandoning its foundations. Its focus on pastoral engagement was not a rejection of dogma, but a recognition of the need to present timeless truths in ways that resonate with contemporary humanity. By situating Vatican II within the broader context of church councils, we can avoid the distortions that arise from overemphasizing any single council. Vatican II was not a revolution, but a renewal, one that must be understood as part of the Church's living tradition. The challenges of its implementation are a reminder of the human element in the Church's history, but they do not diminish the Council's authentic contributions to the life of the Church. As the most recent Ecumenical Council, Vatican II occupies a unique position in the Church's history, but this temporal proximity has led to an overemphasis on its significance. Humans are naturally prone to what C.S. Lewis called chronological snobbery, the tendency to view the latest developments as the most important while neglecting the wisdom of the past. This tendency has caused Vatican II to be treated, by some, as a rupture rather than a continuation of tradition, with its teachings often misrepresented or used as justification for changes far beyond the Council's intent. This issue is compounded by those with agendas to transform the Church in ways Vatican II never intended. Such individuals or movements have selectively interpreted the Council's documents, or ignored them entirely, to advocate for practices that stray from the Church's teachings. For example, the Council's document on the Liturgy, Sacrosanctum Concilium, explicitly states that Gregorian chant should hold pride of place in the liturgy. Yet in practice, chant has largely been replaced by contemporary music styles, often at the expense of reverence and the sacred character of the liturgy. Similarly, while Sacrosanctum Concilium allowed for the use of vernacular languages in parts of the liturgy to aid the faithful's understanding, it also affirmed that Latin was to be preserved in the Latin rites. In reality, the centrality of Latin in the liturgy has almost entirely disappeared, contrary to the Council's explicit directives. These examples highlight how the implementation of Vatican II has often diverged from the Council's actual teachings, driven by misinterpretations or overzealous attempts to modernize the Church. This phenomenon of overreaction or misapplication is not unique to Vatican II. Other councils in the Church's history have also faced similar challenges. For instance, the Council of Trent, which was vital in responding to the Protestant Reformation, clarified key doctrines and implemented necessary reforms. However, the zeal to enforce orthodoxy and discipline in its aftermath sometimes led to excesses, such as the rigidity of Jansenism, which presented a distorted view of grace and mercy. Similarly, the Counter-Reformation saw a narrowing of artistic and liturgical expression in some areas, which, while aimed at promoting reverence, occasionally veered into unnecessary austerity, going beyond what the Council itself had prescribed. Another example is the aftermath of the First Council of Nicaea. While the Council definitively affirmed the divinity of Christ, the Arian controversy continued for decades, fueled by imperial politics and theological disputes. During this time, some bishops and theologians, in their zeal to defend Nicene orthodoxy, introduced language and ideas that went beyond the Council's definitions, creating further division within the Church. These historical parallels demonstrate that the confusion and overreach following Vatican II are not unprecedented. Councils, by their nature, seek to address the needs of their time, but their teachings require careful interpretation and implementation to avoid distortions. Vatican II, like its predecessors, must be understood in continuity with the Church's entire tradition, rather than isolated or treated as a revolutionary moment. The overemphasis on Vatican II's and the misinterpretations of its teachings have caused significant challenges within the Church. While the Council called for renewal and engagement with the modern world, it did so with a clear grounding in tradition. The neglect of this balance has led to polarizing effects, with some advocating for changes that Vatican II never intended, and others rejecting the Council altogether. By recognizing the lessons of history and situating Vatican II within the broader context of the Church's conciliar tradition, Catholics can move beyond these distortions, embracing the Council's authentic vision while remaining faithful to the unchanging deposit of faith. Vatican II, like all ecumenical councils, stands as an essential moment in the life of the Church, but it is crucial to remember that it is one among many councils. Each council builds upon the one before, clarifying and deepening the Church's understanding of divine revelation without altering the immutable truths of the faith. To overemphasize the most recent council or to treat any council as if it were a revolutionary break risks misunderstanding the very nature of the Church, whose teachings are guided by the Holy Spirit and remain unchanging in their essence. C.S. Lewis's concept of chronological snobbery offers a key insight into the challenges faced by the Church in the wake of Vatican II. This tendency to prioritize the recent over the past has led to an undue focus on Vatican II, as if it were the defining moment of Catholicism, while earlier councils are often neglected or forgotten. This neglect obscures the continuity of the Church's teachings and creates a false dichotomy between pre-Vatican II and post-Vatican II Catholicism. Such thinking undermines the doctrine of continuity, which holds that the Church's teachings develop organically over time without contradicting or replacing what came before. The danger of overreacting to any council, whether Vatican II or another, lies in the temptation to go beyond the Council's actual teachings. This has been particularly evident in the aftermath of Vatican II, where changes implemented in the spirit of Vatican II have often distorted the Council's true intent. Many of these changes ignored the Council's emphasis on preserving tradition while engaging with the modern world. For example, Sacrosanctum Concilium explicitly called for Gregorian chant to retain pride of place in the liturgy, yet chant has been almost entirely replaced by contemporary music styles, many of which lacked the sacred character the Council sought to preserve. Similarly, while the Council allowed for the use of vernacular languages in the liturgy to foster understanding, it also stated that Latin was to be preserved in the Latin rites. Instead, Latin has all but disappeared from the liturgy, contrary to the Council's directives. These deviations reflect a broader misunderstanding of the Church's nature and mission. The Church cannot change in her essence. Her teachings on faith and morals are timeless and unalterable. Councils are called not to change the Church, but to clarify and apply her teachings to the challenges of their time. When overzealous reforms are introduced in the name of a council, they often distort rather than enhance the Church's witness. The so-called spirit of Vatican II has been invoked to justify liturgical abuses, doctrinal ambiguities, and even outright dissent, none of which align with the Council's actual teachings or the Church's immutable nature. This phenomenon is not unique to Vatican II. History shows that similar overreactions occurred after other councils. Following the Council of Trent, for instance, the Counter-Reformation brought many necessary reforms, but it also saw instances of excessive rigidity, such as Jansenism, which misrepresented the Church's teaching on grace and mercy. Similarly, after the First Council of Nicaea, the Church endured decades of conflict over Arianism, with some defenders of Nicene orthodoxy introducing language and ideas that went beyond what the Council had defined, further deepening divisions. These examples highlight the importance of reading councils in the broader context of the Church's tradition. No council exists in isolation, nor should any be treated as a revolutionary moment. To do so risks breaking with the doctrine of continuity that safeguards the Church's teachings across centuries. Vatican II, like all councils, must be understood as part of the Church's ongoing mission to clarify and apply the truths of the faith, not to replace or contradict them. In conclusion, the Church's history teaches us to be mindful of two dangers: overemphasizing the most recent council at the expense of others, and overreacting to any council's teachings. Vatican II was a moment of renewal, not rupture. Regardless of some people's decision to attempt to use it to case a rupture, and its true significance can only be appreciated when it is viewed in continuity with the Church's entire conciliar tradition. The doctrine of the Church's immutability reminds us that councils do not change the Church. They clarify her teachings for the faithful in every age. By resisting the temptations of chronological snobbery and overzealous reforms, we can remain faithful to the Church's mission and preserve the unity of her teachings, guided by the Spirit of truth.